Allora, riprendiamo i lavori della seconda parte della mattinata e qui iniziamo a entrare più nel dettaglio delle cose che nella prima parte vi abbiamo soltanto detto in maniera, diciamo, ancora appunto non dettagliata. Cioè andiamo a vedere nella sostanza che cosa succede a livello nazionale, quindi qui ci muoviamo sul livello nazionale, nei 6 paesi che abbiamo preso in considerazione, e ci sono le 2 relazioni dei gruppi di ricerca che di questo si sono occupati, che sono il gruppo di ricerca di Warwick con Guglielmo Meardi, Manuela Galetto e Anna Mori, adesso Anna Mori all'Università di Milano, e il gruppo di ricerca dell'Università Autonoma di Barcellona con Oscar Molina e Alejandro Godino, e in più c'è anche Antonio Martina Artiles, che però oggi non può essere con noi. Queste relazioni si soffermeranno un po' sui temi che abbiamo visto nella prima parte della mattinata, quindi si chiederanno quali sono le dinamiche specifiche di inclusione e attivazione nei vari paesi europei e se le parti sociali contano. Lo faranno con riferimento ai 6 paesi che abbiamo preso in considerazione, ma queste dinamiche, cioè se le parti sociali contano, diciamo, si trovano, e attraverso quali pratiche, si trovano non solo nei paesi che noi abbiamo studiato, ma anche in altri paesi. E su questo vi faccio vedere brevissimamente una pillola sul ruolo delle parti sociali nei vari paesi europei di Susan Hayter.
Social partners have influenced more inclusive policies, where we see that the social partners played an important role during the crisis in countries such as Netherlands, Switzerland, I can think of Norway, to try and influence extension policies, the policies by which collective agreements were extended and applied to include posted workers, non-standard workers, contract workers, many of whom in those low-paid jobs are, of course, women. In Germany, what we saw was the social partners playing a very important role in lobbying and in finally succeeding in establishing a new minimum wage. That legislation, part of that legislation, is actually to strengthen collective bargaining and strengthen the extension mechanism, and that is targeted particularly at low wage workers and excluded groups that are typically vulnerable.
Quindi, come avete visto, non solo dialogo sociale, ma anche altre forme di influenza, come appunto la contrattazione collettiva, le pratiche di estensione, eccetera. Andiamo a vedere un po' nel concreto cosa è successo nei paesi che abbiamo preso in considerazione. La prima delle 2 relazioni si sofferma sui paesi mediterranei, una comparazione tra il caso italiano e il caso spagnolo, con Oscar Molina.
Grazie Luigi. So, it's not the first time that I do this presentation, but I guess it's going to be the hardest one because I've never presented to such an Italian audience. So, you know, talking about Italy and Spain in comparative perspective is always difficult because it's difficult to make a balance between similarities and differences, and you tend to highlight more sometimes the similarities, sometimes the differences. But I hope that I will show which are the most important aspects of the Italian and the Spanish case, and that the comparison brings something out interesting for you. So, well, we have already talked about the objectives of the research, so I will not talk about this any longer. We know that we are talking about, you know, how to find new equilibriums between active and passive labor market policies, income support and activation, and based on this European Commission recommendation on active inclusion. But this is something we have already talked, and I will not say anything. Okay. About the methodology we have used, was, as Luigi mentioned earlier on, we have mostly used qualitative methods in order to carry on this research. We have made a lot of interviews, both in Italy and Spain, in different levels and to different actors, in order to grasp and to see which were their views on active inclusion in the 2 countries. And as you can see here, we have not only interviewed actors closely related to industrial relations, trade unions and employers associations, but also actors in the public administration, experts in welfare or social policy research and labor market, and also the third sector, which, as Luigi mentioned before also, are pledges that is one of the important findings, I guess, from this research, are pledges that are their role is increasingly important in these issues. So just a little bit of context of these two countries that we are comparing now, Italy and Spain. So as you all know, these are the two countries, and some of the data that was shown before make it very clear. These two countries have strongly dualized and segmented labor markets, where we find differences between workers with different types of contracts, age, sectors, and on top of that, these two countries are characterized by very strong regional disparities. So that makes even more difficult the comparison, and that also adds another, makes also more complex to talk about the national level and compare to these two countries, because when you look at the regional level, you find very marked differences in the two countries. Regarding what has happened in the last years, regarding some of the trends we are dealing with in this project, well, since the 80s in the two countries, we have observed a process of decentralization in employment and social policies, whereby the national governments have decentralized, in some cases, only the implementation, in some cases also the policy design of some areas. We have seen in the two countries only since the late 90s how activation policies have played an increasingly important role, and only once the EU has made it clear that the two countries had to develop this policy. So to some extent they have been developed under EU guidelines. It's not something that came out from policymaking at national level. And another important aspect to be taken into consideration before we enter into the comparison of the two countries is that in both cases we find strong problems regarding horizontal and vertical coordination that are one of the dimensions we look very closely, because active inclusion means coordination across policy areas, and also because we adopt this multi-level perspective. And these two countries are characterized, first of all, by difficulties to coordinate between different policy areas, labor market, social policy, and also to coordinate between actors. And as we saw before, these are the two countries where social dialogue has experienced strong discontinuities in the last, well, always, but particularly in the last 20 years, where we have seen these ups and downs. And then we also see these problems to coordinate vertically policies, and there has been this decentralization, as we saw before, but very often there hasn't been a clear definition of who was in charge of doing what. There was no clear definition of the roles and responsibilities between levels in this process of decentralization, and this partly explains why we are now witnessing the opposite process of recentralization, as I will comment later on. A bit more of context on these two countries. Well, the two countries are champions in Europe, finally, regarding, for instance, long-term unemployment, and particularly youth long-term unemployment. As you can see here, how in the two countries there has been a sharp increase in this indicator, whereby Spain has caught up with Italy, starting from lower levels. And we are looking at another indicator, people at risk of poverty. We also see how there has been an increase as a result of the crisis in the two countries, and we have similar levels in that regard too. Just to go into the topics we are talking about, how has entered the discourse on active inclusion in the two countries? And here we always, the dynamics of the presentation, we will always compare the two countries in this way. So, in this case, the two countries share a weak and fragmented kind of implementation of the discourse on active inclusion, whereby we haven't seen an attempt to implement in a coordinated way and the government hasn't made any plan to implement active inclusion policies in a coherent way in the two countries. The governments have taken bits and parts of the whole idea and have highlighted some and have implemented some more than others, but not in a kind of coherent way. What we've seen in this regard, and this is partly a result of this kind of fragmentation and weakness of the discourse, is that depending on the problem load in the two countries, the emphasis has been placed in one thing or another. And so what we see in the case of Italy is how the emphasis on labor market reforms has been placed on extending coverage of income support policies, either unemployment protection or other type of policies, whilst in Spain, because the main problem was the very high unemployment rate reaching I think 25% in 2012, the emphasis was on creating jobs. No matter how good are these jobs, but we have to create jobs. And the issue of income support has actually been weakened, as we will see later on. Regarding the issue of unemployment and who is responsible and who has to take care of the people who are unemployed, following or similarly to what was mentioned before, in the two countries we see this paradigm change whereby we have shift from a social responsibility of unemployment, that is, the state is responsible for taking care of those who are unemployed, and we have seen how the state is gradually kind of shifting the burden of being unemployed to the individual and kind of obliging the individual to do something in order to leave this situation. Now, regarding adequate income, when we compare the two countries, Italy and Spain, well, the first thing we see is that whilst there is no national minimum income scheme in Italy, there are regional and local schemes. In Spain there is one, yes, very low, but there is one. And this issue is a very important one for also collective bargaining in the case of Spain. Regarding income support programs, well, whilst in Italy the measures have been made in order to support low-income households, and there has been an extension in unemployment protection schemes. Well, in Spain we have seen the reverse. There was a universal scheme. The coverage was relatively high, but with the crisis we have seen how there has been both a decrease in the coverage and at the same time a fragmentation in the system, whereby now there are more programs targeted to specific groups like young people, those over 45 that are unemployed, etc. So in this sense, we see very different trends in the case of Italy and Spain. In the case of Italy, there has been a trend towards extending coverage, making it more universal, whilst in Spain, the trend is precisely the opposite. I'm going very rapidly because I want to leave time for the discussion that I think is the important thing. Now, regarding employment policies in the two countries, well, partly as a result of the crisis, and it's something that you can understand, the crisis has triggered an increase in unemployment, so there was a need to support the income of those who were unemployed. But at the same, and there has been a kind of a crowding out effect. The states have shifted resources from active labor market policies towards passive labor market policies or income protection. That is, we can understand that, but we see how this trend is to some extent maintained in the sense that there is no reversal. There is no increase now in the expenditure on active labor market policies. And not talking about levels of expenditure, but about governance of employment policies in the two countries, this is a very important trend that we have seen. In the two cases, we have seen a reversal of that trend that I mentioned before that started in the 80s towards a decentralization in employment policies. We have seen in the two cases a re-centralization in the employment policies, in the way employment policies are governed, through different mechanisms, in a most softer way. In Italy, there is this idea in the Jobs Act. I think it hasn't been implemented yet, but at least it's in the document, of creating this national employment agency that will, play a role of coordinating employment policies across the different regions. And in Spain, we see a much harder kind of mechanism of recentralization towards these annual employment plans that basically mean that the state will follow very closely how the money on active labor market policies is used across the regions, and will decide which regions get more and which regions get less. So in that sense, there is this recentralization. Now, talking about social dialogue, and I'm finishing, what has happened in the two countries? Well, nothing new. In the two cases, we have seen how the relevance of social dialogue is decreasing. These are the two countries where there has been the major discontinuities in social dialogue during the crisis, where the state has played a very prominent role in articulating the responses to the crisis, and compared to other countries where there has been more negotiation about how do we deal with these problems, as Luigi mentioned before, these two cases are characterized by a very statistic kind of response. And one of the emerging trends that also was mentioned before, and I think is worth mentioning here, is that in the two cases, we see how new actors are becoming more important and are also kind of participating in social dialogue together with the traditional actors, trade unions and employers. We see the third sector that is emerging very slowly as a result partly of the crisis, and the government is inviting, for instance, in the case of Spain, to participate in the drafting of the national reform programs, and they are becoming a very important actor at national level in these issues. So just to finish and not take more time, which are the most important things coming out from this, the analysis of these two countries? Well, we see the first thing is that these overarching paradigms, active inclusion, flexicurity, and that require high levels of policy integration and coordination, have the risk of having very little impact, and that governments pick up different elements of the paradigms and apply them according to national priorities, etc. So it's kind of a menu effect. There are a number of general kind of ideas, and every national actors pick up on these ideas according to the national context, the priorities, etc. It is true that active inclusion and the paradigm has provided this common cognitive framework, in the sense that there are some ideas in there, they are in the discourse in a fragmented way, but still they are. But it's still possible to identify models of inclusive labor markets. That is, the general ideas are there, but there are very different national situations still. So it's not that we see a convergence, but we see how these general ideas are applied very differently across countries. Social dialogue and social and industrial relations actors in general in the two countries have played a very marginal role in recent years. In the case of Italy, obviously, the regional level and the local level is still important regarding the social dialogue compared to Spain. But in the two countries, we see a national level that is what we are talking about now, how this social dialogue has weakened. And finally, and as I just mentioned, I think it's very important to highlight this recentralization in employment and income support policies, because it really marks a turning point. And in that sense, one of the objectives of the research was to look at what was happening regarding governance of labor market and social policies. Now we see that as a result of the crisis, there are some very significant changes are taking place, and this is something probably we should look more closely in future research. Thank you.